This is the Sports and Society podcast, where we go beyond scores, statistics, and personalities to focus on issues and controversies in sports worlds. Your hosts, Jake Oakley and Jeff Montes de Oca, are sports sociologists and the authors of the book, Sports and Society, Issues and Controversies. The episodes in this podcast give you a behind-the-scenes look at the textbook with stories from our lives as scholars and athletes, as well as providing analysis of ongoing issues and controversies in contemporary sport worlds. We welcome hearing your thoughts and analysis, so please use this space to engage with us about the textbook or any of the topics we cover in this podcast. Hello and welcome to the Sports and Society podcast. Your hosts are Jake Oakley and Jeff Montes de Oca. In this episode, we are discussing the cost of sports on fans, athletes, and communities with two amazing scholars. This episode is directly related to Chapter 9 on social class, but also Chapter 11 on sports and the economy, and Chapter 13 on sports and politics. So our two hosts, the first one is Jules Boykoff. He's the author of Red Card, the 2026 World Cup, Sport Washing, and the FIFA Greed Machine. That's pretty relevant since the World Cup 2026 is going on right now. And Kicking, a memoir about his former life as a professional footballer and his current life as a critical academic of sport. He has also written 6 books on the politics of the Olympics. Most recently, What Are the Olympics For? His writing has appeared in outlets such as The Nation, The Guardian, The Los Angeles Times, New York Times, The Globe and Mail, Folha de Sao Paulo, and Common Dreams. He teaches political science at Pacific University, is currently a visiting scholar at Nanterre University in Paris. And I can say Jules is a highly productive scholar. We also have Carrie Ann Robertson. She's an assistant professor at Fordham University's Department of Communication and Media Studies. She researches the impacts of stadiums and mega events on cities and how people organize around these spectacular development projects and occasions. She is also an organizer of the No Olympics LA, a coalition of LA area community organizations that oppose the Olympics coming to Los Angeles in 2028. She previously lived in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and worked for RioOnWatch.org, which reported on the 2014 World Cup and the 2026 Olympics impacts on favelas. Welcome to the podcast, Carrie Ann and Jules.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
So happy to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, this is really exciting. And this is our first episode of the 3rd season, so we're really stoked to give away my California roots. So why don't we jump in with our first questions? We ask everybody that comes on the podcast these 2 questions. Why don't we start with, let's start with Carrie Ann, because Jules, we're going to be asking you quite a bit about your sports biography, but Carrie Ann, and I'm saying your name correctly, right? Carrie Ann? Okay, great.
Yep.
Please describe your experience in sports.
Yeah. So I grew up doing gymnastics. I grew up playing a lot of tennis, neither all that well, but I had a lot of fun doing them. But I think the sport that really has actually been bigger in shaping what I research today is soccer. My family is British. I moved from the UK to the US when I was 7 years old. Sadly, lost the cute accent. But I think maybe around that time, as you know, those changes were happening, I held on to what I then called football, soccer, as a way to really stay connected with my roots, with my family overseas. And so it's a sort of all-consuming love as a kid, as a teenager. And that's what sort of started getting me interested in mega events along the line when I was, obsessed with watching the World Cup, loved watching the Olympics and so forth.
And Carrie Ann, when you were at Cambridge, did you attend any of the Premier League games, matches, and other things going on in Europe at the time?
I didn't, and that was partly because the tickets were so expensive, and I was a poor grad student at the time, so I wanted to go see my beloved Chelsea FC play, but I didn't, because when I looked up the prices, I was like, well, I don't know if I can afford that right now. which I think is a theme we'll be getting into more later today.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, I kick myself. I went to NYU for 2 years and never went to the US Open, which I really wish I had taken the time to do that. Jules, why don't you briefly talk about your history in sport?
Sure. Well, I started playing soccer at a very young age. I was 4 years old, and my mother enrolled me on a soccer team of under 8 players. So I was the smallest and youngest person. I actually was too young to play, but my mother insisted. My mother has a disability. She had polio when she was a kid, and she walks to this day with a severe limp. And she tells me she needed a break, basically. I was a very active kid, and she was like, gotta sign him up for something to like let this guy's energy out. So a 4-year-old, she threw me in with these 8-year-olds, and I loved it. I absolutely loved it. Like, I love the physicality. I was getting bopped around by all these older kids. I love the community. I just loved everything about it. I loved how it's a skill game and it's also a brain game. And so that kind of got me started. Thanks, Mom, for that. And, over time, I realized I just love the sport, and eventually sort of winnowed away other sports that I was playing, like baseball, basketball, hockey, and just started focusing exclusively on soccer. I went the exclusive route, probably I was about 14 years old, which is kind of late, actually, compared to what athletes do today. But this was the 80s, and soccer wasn't quite what it is today. And only a few years later, I found myself at the age of 19 playing for the U.S. under-23 men's national soccer team in matches in France, where we played against Brazil. We played against the country that was then Yugoslavia, what was then Czechoslovakia. And guys, I actually played against the Soviet Union in 1990. And we lost, actually, to the Soviet Union. And I say all that to say this. I kind of was weaned on a steady diet of pro-U.S. American propaganda going into that tournament. So I kind of expected as a 19-year-old that I'd get there and everybody in France was going to be cheering for us. And it was going to be this wonderful moment of kumbaya, United States and French people getting along. But that was not what would happen. And in fact, we got a cold shoulder just about everywhere we went. And so I realized then that I had a lot to learn about geopolitics. And as a student in college at that time, and I went back home, I was at University of Wisconsin at that moment. And I started studying politics a lot more and looking at the relationship between politics and sports. So that's kind of how it all started for me. In terms of how it affects like what I do now, I mean, I think it does affect it. I'm interested, just as I was as a 19-year-old in Paris, in the reactions of everyday people. That's kind of what my research is today. I start and I go to the mega event city and I live there for as long as I can, and I meet everyday people, working class people, and I talk to them about how these sports mega events affect their lives. I've seen with my own two eyes how sport can build community. I've benefited from that community building. I've also seen how it can create a social foundation for engaging in politics, which is something I'm really interested in. And so, last thing I'll just say about this is that I do see huge overlaps between thinking about my life as an athlete and my life as a scholar and a writer. I mean, you need to get there and go to practice every day, even when you don't necessarily feel like it. You need to be ready to work hard all the time, and even when, again, you don't maybe feel like it. And there's a big difference, though. And that is like when I was playing soccer, if you expressed any self-doubt about your skills and what you could do on the field, that stuff could be sniffed by the opposition and they'd be all over you and they just take advantage of you. And I was on the lookout for that kind of stuff too in my opponents. But with academic writing, I think some of the very best things I've written were built on the sort of axle of self-doubt, where I said, I got to look at this and think about it from yet another angle and yet another angle. And only then did I come up with something that I really ended up feeling good and proud about.
That's such a great point. Thinking about, how there is a space in academic writing for self-doubt and self-criticism, and using that to fuel us. And I wanted to shift over to Carrie Ann because, Jules talked about this moment where he goes to France, plays the Soviet Union, and the reality is inconsistent with the expectations he was given and all the propaganda we receive, growing up, or, I'm sure everywhere, but especially in the United States, as Jules talked about. And that led to a set of questions for him. And in a lot of ways, like, okay, so you and I, we were not high level athletes. We were not elite athletes like Jules was, but we had really, positive experiences growing up with sport and fandom, and the fandom being so crucial to our connections with our families. But then you still became a critical scholar. Can you talk about that? How, even though you got the England jersey on right now, you're clearly still a huge sports fan, but also a critical scholar. How do you explain being a critical scholar and a sports fan?
Yeah, as Jules was talking about that moment where expectation contrasted so starkly with the sort of reality that he was seeing, I think it's a very similar moment for me when I was in college, when I was an undergrad. That was in 2010. The first World Cup, the first FIFA World Cup on the African continent was taking place in South Africa. And I applied for college funding to go get an internship there exclusively because I wanted to go to the World Cup, right? The internship was the cover story. The real purpose was the World Cup. And it was a dream come true. I got to see England play. I got to see England be destroyed by Germany 4-1. That was terrible. But in so many ways, the event itself really lived up to my expectations in terms of this beautiful, celebratory, multicultural event. However, there was also that internship, right? And that internship turned out to be with a legal rights organization based in Johannesburg. And so when I wasn't at games, I was writing reports on things that the lawyers had been working on, issues like evictions to make way for the stadiums, issues like police cracking down pretty aggressively on protesters who were saying, hey, this World Cup actually isn't so great for us. There were also stories around street vendors who were being pushed out of the spaces they usually sold their wares in because, these were zones that only official corporate sponsors could sell in during the World Cup. And so there was this massive dissonance, right? And I think I'd been very naive coming into it in terms of only imagining the sort of beautiful event aspect. But that internship was so fundamental in terms of raising all these other questions. And as a fan, the obvious big question is how can we accept this? Like, how is this an okay cost for this thing that we want to enjoy? What might we need in order to make this an event that we could actually enjoy ethically? And if we can't, like, what does it mean to still go to a game? Am I okay with that? So, the stuff I research now is very much looking at these big, spectacular mega events like the FIFA World Cup, the Olympics, but also the stadiums themselves, because I've become really interested in, the physical spaces that cost a ton of money, take up a ton of land, and have really massive impacts on their local communities when you build a new one. So I look at, how do these affect the local community? How do people around the events or the stadiums organize to demand what they need or want as a community? And some of the politics that play into that in terms of, who is it that's driving these projects and why? What are some people getting out of it? Who benefits and who really loses out here?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we want to focus on a little bit here is what happens when the mega event is being prepared for. And I was just in Washington, and I was talking to in Seattle, Washington, and I was talking to some people there who were telling me all about how homeless people were being moved out of the area around the stadium. Uh, and that really created havoc for them because they had created uh, a sustenance lifestyle, in this location. And when they moved, they lost all their contacts. They didn't know where to sleep. They didn't know where to go for food. And I think both you and Jules can talk about what happens in the areas around a stadium when a mega event comes to town.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that's one of the most common negative impacts of these events. It doesn't matter what city, what country is hosting. There's pressure on that host to, the global media is coming to town, tourists are coming to town. There's a lot of pressure to sell an image of the city, to sell an image of the country. And a lot of political leaders, a lot of business leaders want that image to be, quote unquote, very clean, to show economic prosperity. And homelessness doesn't usually fit what some of those organizers of these events want to show off to the world. And so, yeah, we see time and time again the rights of people who are living on the street violated, and as people are just pushed out of sight. And as you said, Jay, this, I think, if people who don't necessarily know a lot about homelessness, they might think, okay, well, they're on one street. What does it matter if they're pushed to somewhere else? But people absolutely are forming communities. They're choosing certain locations for a reason, close to resources, with the people that they want to be near and need to be near, for support. And it's incredibly disruptive. And I know, Jules, you can talk a lot about this too.
Yeah, I'll take the baton there, Carrie Ann. I mean, there's so many examples, Jay, of unhoused people getting the boot in advance of a sports mega event. In fact, the very first sports mega event that I looked at on the ground as a researcher was Vancouver, the Olympics there in 2010. And I went there in 2009. There was something called that the activists in town were calling the Olympics Kidnapping Act, because that wasn't its official title or anything, but that's because they were calling that because it was basically giving pretense to police and social workers and others to take unhoused people off the streets so that when the global media arrived, they wouldn't see the social problem that was clearly bricked into society. I mean, this is one of the chronic social problems with sports mega events, whether we're talking about the Olympics or whether we're talking about the World Cup. I mean, to put a finer point on it, in the lead into the South Korea Olympics in Seoul in 1988, more than 700,000 people were booted from their homes to make way for the Olympics then. China, even according to some human rights groups, displaced more than 1 million people. And it doesn't just happen in East Asia. I mean, you look at Atlanta, 1996, when they hosted the Olympics there, police were taking unhoused people and either putting them in jail or giving them one-way bus tickets out of town. They were arresting so many Black men off the streets of Atlanta who were just hanging out on the streets that the police were pre-writing tickets saying African-American male so that it'd be faster to process these and just add the person's name and other information. So this is a problem that's deep and embedded. I first had the good fortune of meeting Carrie Ann in Rio de Janeiro, where Carrie Ann was working there with a really important community group called Catalytic Communities and spearheading their Rio on Watch program. And I was a Fulbright research fellow there in Rio de Janeiro 2015 and 2016, and 77,000 people were displaced by the Rio Olympics, according to the city's own numbers. So this is one of these sort of ignominious traditions of sports mega events, and we're definitely seeing it, as you pointed out, Jay, 2026 in Seattle, Vancouver, and elsewhere.
And just to add quickly, Jules, you mentioned the World Cup, the Olympics. We see a version of it for the Super Bowls here in the U.S. as well, especially around homelessness, right? So it's become pretty regular now each year. As the Super Bowl moves from city to city, we see local reports where local community members are saying the same thing again and again. This encampment was pushed out, or this shelter was shut down. Here I'm in Los Angeles now, and so when we had the Super Bowl in the LA area in 2022, there was a big encampment between LAX, our airport, and SoFi Stadium where the Super Bowl was taking place. It was very visible on the side of the road. And two and a half weeks before the Super Bowl, sure enough, it was pretty aggressively displaced and people were told to move along. Now, the city mayor where it took place, and state workers who actually sort of did the displacing said, oh, no, this has nothing to do with the Super Bowl. The timing is just coincidental. But I actually spoke to some of the folks who were displaced, and they said, well, we were told we explicitly had to move west away from the stadium. We were told we could not move towards the stadium. So in their eyes, it was very clear. They were asked to move because the city didn't want tourists arriving from the airport to see that encampment on their way to the game.
Wow, this is really powerful. And you're illustrating one of the ways in which we want to talk about the costs of mega sporting events, right? The cost to communities. And I want to stay on this topic. But we also want to talk about the cost to athletes and the cost to fans. But let's stay on this topic of the cost to communities. So one of the costs is clearly the displacement of the unhoused and other issues around housing. What are some of the other, just costs that a community has to bear? There's obviously the financial cost of the Olympics. I think in the textbook we cited, I think the the Olympics in Tokyo 2024 was $21 billion is what it costs to host those Olympics. Um, so that's a giant financial cost. But yeah, so what are some of these costs that communities need to bear in order to host these events?
Yeah, I mean, starting with the costs, like you're saying, it's a great place to start because every 2 years, researchers from Oxford University come out with a study that looks at what the organizers of the Olympics said that was going to cost and then what it actually cost. And they found that every single Olympics going back to 1960, for which there is reliable data, has gone over in terms of its cost. So it is like etch-a-sketch economics, as I've sometimes called it, where they put the original number on the etch-a-sketch that it's only going to be this, it's going to be great, folks. And then when the actual event comes around, they shake up that etch-a-sketch and write a brand new number that's inevitably much higher. So that's one of the things. And of course, who bears the cost there? It's people in the city and the country, the taxpayers of the city and the country who pay for the event. The second is we've already been talking about displacement, so we can kind of move beyond that. But the third, I would say, is policing. So basically, local and national police forces use sports mega events like their own private cash machine to get all the special weapons and laws that they'd never be able to get during normal political times. These events bring what are called a state of exception, where the normal rules of politics don't apply. And so they get new weapons. I'll give you an example. I was in Paris for the 2024 Olympics, covering it with my friend and colleague Dave Zirin at The Nation magazine. And we were looking at the new technology that France was allowing just for the Olympics called AI video surveillance. So that no one in Europe had allowed there to be AI-powered video surveillance in any of their communities. But because Paris was hosting the 2024 Olympics, France made an exception. And this is kind of how it can often happen. There was a sunset provision on that, so it sunset in a few months after the Olympics, but now they're talking about bringing it back because France is hosting the 2030 Olympics, the Winter Olympics this time. A fourth trend that we see, scholars see when they're looking at these sports mega events in terms of costs, is greenwashing, because both the International Olympic Committee and FIFA like to talk a big game in terms of environmental sustainability. Oh, we want to save the planet, this and that. But the follow through is often lacking. In fact, it's almost always lacking. And so there's a big gap between what they say about sustainability and what they do about sustainability. And the last cost that I've been really interested in is just corruption and how it corrodes a society. And especially in a moment where there's a rising tide of authoritarianism around the globe, we need to have more faith in our institutions, a deeper commitment to democracy. And instead, these sports mega events tend to be these sort of cauldrons of corruption that really undermine our willingness to believe in our leaders and what they say and what they actually do. I mean, the Salt Lake City Olympics is sort of the big daddy controversy and corruption scandal of all time, where you had people from the Salt Lake Bid Committee giving enormous sums of money to people on the voting edge of the International Olympic Committee, giving their family members free scholarships to college to, like, if they vote for them, and violins and tickets to the Utah Jazz basketball game. The list was really long, but that's not the only place where corruption happens. And so for me, those are the major costs. And you'll notice who bears those costs is everyday people in these various cities.
And as we, in LA, as we're preparing for the 2028 Olympics, hosting the World Cup this year, we're kind of seeing all those issues that Jules laid out. So just on the cost front, to go back to that, LA is making, the organizers of these Olympics are making a big deal about how this Olympics is different. It's going to be privately funded. But it turns out that official budget that is privately funded is missing two of the biggest items, two of the biggest costs. One is transit. Like, oops, we forgot to include all the transportation of all the fans and all the people who come here. That's going to be publicly funded. And the other one is security. And as we just heard Jules say, that's a huge item for any of these events now. So in LA, we're expecting, we're already actually seeing the LA Police Department, the LA sheriffs use the Olympics to argue we need more people. We need to hire more officers. We need more, of this AI security, as Jules, sort of surveillance technologies, as Jules mentioned. We need more automated license plate readers. That's a big one right now in Los Angeles, where, we're in a moment where we're seeing the federal government use ICE in particular to come in and terrorize our communities, our neighborhoods. And the idea of adding an additional technology that helps police agencies track people is something that I think a vast majority of Angelenos know we do not want that. But that's one of the things that local forces and federal agencies together are saying, oh, well, if you want to host the Olympics, you're going to need this. And one of the things I've learned from Jules over the years is I think, Jules, you always have this phrase that, like, when the police get these new toys, they don't just get put back in the box after the Olympics, right? These are going to be here. And so once they're here, they're going to stay long after the Olympics. And that's a different kind of legacy than what the Olympics organizers talk about, right? So we're concerned about the kind of long-term expansion of these policing technologies. Just the other day, during a World Cup game, and so the stadium here we call it the LA Stadium, but it's actually in the city of Inglewood. And there was a beautiful block party in Inglewood where, there were screens up so people could watch the game. There was a market. People were playing sort of like little pickup soccer on some small just AstroTurf little courts that had been set up in the street. And I was walking along with some of my friends, and then we realized there were snipers sitting on the rooftops. Snipers with rifles pointing down at the kids playing soccer. Now, I think it's important to know Inglewood is a majority Black and Latino city. I don't know that we would have seen the same thing in a place like Beverly Hills, for example. And I think the sort of racial dynamics of who gets policed, who gets seen as a potential threat, are unfortunately very predictable. And the way that, especially because a lot of our stadiums here are in predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods, a lot of them are very concerned. You say you're bringing more policing here. We know that to be a threat. We understand that to put us at greater risk. And that's all almost before mentioning ICE, right? ICE for the LA Olympics is going to be part of that sort of giant security apparatus. And that is a great concern for us as well. Just one more thing I'll add quickly about LA specifics to what Jules was saying. At the end there, you were talking about the sort of corruption. I think in my mind, that links to just an overall lack of control, lack of democratic control that the city has over its own planning. Because, in our case, the city signed a contract back in 2017 with the International Olympic Committee. And here we are 9 years later, and we're seeing our city council finally ask questions like, wait, what do you mean we can't do this? Because we've agreed to be ready for the Olympics by 2028. They're asking things like, where are the plans for the Olympics? We're the city council. Shouldn't we know? But all this planning process is taking place by this private LA 28 organizing committee. And so there's a lack of transparency. There's a lack of agency for the democratically elected leaders of our city. And that's a big problem in terms of, what are we seeding when we kind of sign up to host these big events?
Yeah. And I just want to piggyback on that a little bit, because what happens is whenever a mega event is coming to town, it turns the whole scene into a monopoly. And it's a FIFA monopoly for World Cups. It's an IOC monopoly for the Olympics. It's an NFL monopoly for Super Bowls. And what happens is that the other, as you're saying, Carrie Ann, the other issues is about community involvement and support and so on. All of those things get pushed to the side, and all of those voices are silenced, and the monopoly takes over. And it's, kind of a temporary one, although there are some remnants that stick around afterwards. So I wonder if either of you could talk about how that works.
Absolutely. I mean, to give one powerful example of the dynamic that you're identifying there, Jay, look at those Tokyo Olympics that Jeff was mentioning before, because those occurred during the long moment of coronavirus. So those were actually postponed from 2020 to 2021. And even in 2021, there was some public polling done a few months before the Olympics were supposed to start. And 83% of the population in Tokyo did not want to host the Olympics. They were an under-vaccinated population. The thought of having all these people from around the world come there with whatever diseases they might be carrying was a very scary prospect. Not to mention the fact that the Olympics, like Jeff said, had gone way over budget and they were losing their popularity by the day. And so people are like, yeah, can't we just like cancel them or push them back another year? And the prime minister at the time had to get on TV and admit in public that he did not have the power to cancel those Olympics, that actually the monopoly that you're talking about, Jay, did. And that was, in that case, the International Olympic Committee. They had the power to decide whether Japan was going to host this mega event or not, and if so, when they were going to host it. So that really said a lot to me about what your question is asking.
And just to add a different example, here in LA with the FIFA World Cup, we're seeing city councilors really struggle with the limitations that FIFA put on in terms of FIFA's protecting their own sort of corporate sponsors' interests. So, it's the World Cup. We want to celebrate it in different neighborhoods. City councilors are looking to organize watch parties in their communities. And they quickly found out they could not advertise those with the word FIFA. They couldn't use the word World Cup because those are FIFA's property. And so you have to figure out. So I think the official city term for these local events is now kick it in the park, which technically it doesn't name the World Cup. It doesn't name FIFA, and it's a kind of a clever workaround. But, it's frustrating when people are trying to get their communities excited about these things. And then they're told, oh, actually, that's our intellectual property. You can't even name the event that you want to host, but you will have to pay for it, right? Because FIFA doesn't contribute to the funding of these local watch parties. That falls on local city administration. And, they are like, okay, if we're going to pay for it, maybe we can advertise, maybe we can bring in some local sponsors. And again, FIFA says, no, you can't have any sponsors that conflict with our specific sponsorship. So we have Visa, so you can't have any credit card companies involved. We have this hotel, so you can't have any hotel sponsorships that are different. So they've made it really hard for anyone in the city to fundraise to cover these costs by all their kind of, as you said, Jay, the monopoly that they have over even this intellectual property.
I like, Carrie Ann, you said something to the effect of the legacy that isn't promised by the organizers. That, and it makes me think about the very first Olympics I remember watching was the 1976 Winter Olympics in Montreal. And then I was an adult when they finally paid off the debt on those Olympics, which it makes me think about, and we all get students like this, and they're good students. They're critical, and they're skeptical when we talk about the issues with mega sport events, and they might be thinking something to the effect of, yeah, but there's a lot of benefits to bringing these world-class events to our communities, the marketing of the city and the increased economic activity and investment that it brings. And, I'm not unhoused. I don't break the law, so I don't worry about increased policing. And hey, maybe those police are there to protect me. So when you get these kinds of responses from students and other people, how, why should they be concerned? How do you explain to them why they should be concerned about these costs to communities?
Well, I think one place to start is just naming that some of the economic impacts people assume will come with these events are myths, are really, really popular myths that have kind of been deliberately promoted by some of the organizers of these events. But so just to go to your question about the sort of, won't this bring sort of economic impacts, perhaps to increase spending, perhaps to increase tourism, either just for the event or in the long term. There's really solid economic research that calls into question whether these events are really good or actually really have any impacts on tourism in the long run. So there's a couple of, the 1992 Barcelona Olympics is always referenced as they hosted the Olympics and it was kind of their coming out moment on the global stage. after, decades under Spain's Franco fascist regime, Barcelona emerges as this kind of hidden jewel, and suddenly everyone's, wow, Barcelona looks beautiful. I want to go there. And sure enough, that coincided with an increase in tourism. But I think that gets over referenced because that simply isn't the pattern when we look at other cities. Most cities don't have a long-term increase in tourism after the Olympics. And I think the fact that surprises people even more is that tourism doesn't always even go up during the actual event itself. So imagine you're planning a trip to wherever. Maybe you really want to go to London. You've always wanted to go to London and you want to go to the museums. You're excited about a couple of restaurants. You want to see the Tower of London. And then you realize, oh, this summer they're hosting the Olympics. There's a pretty good chance, unless you're a big Olympics fan, you might think, all right, this is not the summer to go to London, clearly, right? There's going to be huge crowds. Maybe I should save this trip for next year. So this is what economists call the displacement effect. When, yes, of course, a lot of people are coming for the Olympics, but there's a sort of another group of sort of what we might call normal tourists who stay away. There's even an effect where some of the locals are like, I got to get out of here. The traffic's going to be crazy. So they leave town too. So some of the most interesting conversations I've had here, again, around SoFi Stadium, which has already hosted a Super Bowl and is hosting the World Cup, I talked to a lot of local business owners, many of whom were so excited when they first heard the stadium was coming because they expected this windfall every time there was a big event, who've actually said things like, you know what, the Super Bowl was my worst sales day of the year because all my regular customers stayed away. And the traffic was so bad that nobody could get to me. So I think there's, we think these events bring a lot of extra people, bring extra spending. And for sure, there's research that shows, on average, mega event attendees spend a little bit more than the average tourist because, they're paying for those expensive tickets. They probably have a little bit of money to burn. But it's not necessarily an increase in people, which I think is always a surprise to hear.
Literally, a friend of mine who I've published with, he lives in Paris, and he invited me to visit him in 2024. And I was like, no way am I going to Paris when the Olympics are in town. I've been reading Jules Boykoff for years.
Exactly. And actually, Paris is a great reference too. There's a lot of articles about local businesses there, restaurants, saying, what happened? Where were our tourist crowds? Because again, locals went away. There's another dynamic just to connect this to some of the security things we were talking about earlier. Some restaurants and shops actually had, they were disrupted because there were these massive security perimeter fences put up around the city, especially for Paris's opening ceremony, which took place along the Seine. This meant that a large part of the city had this kind of security perimeter like placed on the street. So people's access and their ability to move around the city was actually impinged by this. And any restaurant or other business that was sort of on the wrong side of the fence from its customers really lost out that summer.
Yeah, I was down there at that fence, Carrie Ann, and I was there with my colleague I mentioned before, Dave Zirin, and not only did we see those very businesses that were just hemorrhaging money because of the Olympics because they were behind the fence and we couldn't go there if we wanted to. But when we went up and we're just looking at the fence, we had these guys with long automatic weapons walk up to us and start really grilling us hard. And they got right in Dave Zirin's face and like made him show them his passport and everything and like writing down information about him. We weren't doing anything. We were just like looking through the fence. So I think that's another one of those kind of underbelly legacies that we see here. To add to what you're saying, one of the things that people tell people who host the Olympics or World Cup is that this is going to put your city on the map. In fact, they told Los Angeles this recently because organizers from Los Angeles were talking to FIFA and like, wait a minute, now what are we getting out of this? We're making all these payments just like Carrie Ann described, but what are we getting out of this? And the FIFA person responded to the people of Los Angeles saying, oh, this is going to put Los Angeles on the map. Like Los Angeles, I think people have heard of that before. With the tourism numbers, yes, there is a massive displacement of normal tourists. And I've seen this with my own two eyes in many places where, for example, in London, I was there for the Olympics and before the Olympics, and there were the theater groups there were just decimated. Like nobody was going to the theater in the summer. So like the very institutions, art and theater, that did actually put London on the map in the first place, or at least helped it do so, were losing out because of this thing that was supposedly putting London on the map.
Yeah, I just think about there are so many unintended or maybe unnamed costs that comes with any of these kinds of events that just impacts everybody, whether it's the bad traffic, whether it's the increased surveillance. The One of the things that for those of us who love sports, and I think we all love sports, is the promise that sports gives, that it improves our lives, it helps us improve ourselves, it brings our families and communities together and strengthens all of these things. And these mega sporting events do the exact opposite. As you've outlined, they undermine democracy. They undermine the things that we really care about, and what we love sports for. Uh, One of the places where this happens is around the actual physical infrastructure, the stadiums. And I know this is something you study, Carrie Ann. Um, and so like when I was younger, I remember getting, always hearing that we addressed this a little bit, but I know there's more to say on this, that the stadiums are going to create a multiplier effect, right? A little bit of money or a lot of money put into the stadium is going to ripple through the whole economy and cause a lot of economic activity to go on, and everyone's going to benefit from that. That argument, it doesn't get made so much anymore, but we still get, the argument that it is advantageous for public money to be spent on private real estate. Can you just sort of walk us through this little history of the research on stadium building and the ways in which these stadiums cost communities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's similar, a similar story to what we were describing with these big mega events. The research by economists, again, is pretty united in saying we just don't see this positive impact that some city leaders are talking about, or state governors. In the case of, I'm thinking, the governor of New York, really, really promoting public funding into the new Buffalo Bills stadium, the NFL stadium. So what it kind of boils down to, I think that people talk about sort of three different things. Stadiums create jobs, stadiums bring more taxes, stadiums increase spending in the area. And we kind of already talked about the increased spending in the area. And, as I was saying, a lot of businesses around SoFi Stadium in Inglewood in Los Angeles are saying, nope, it's actually bad for us. On jobs, that's an interesting one because for sure, just, literally, yes, there are some jobs. There are construction jobs that go into the first phase of getting the stadium up. Those are temporary, of course, right? So that's, those have an end date. And then there's hospitality and operations jobs once the stadium's up and running. Now, the thing with these is, yes, there are jobs. If you think about games, sports events, they're not happening all the time, right? So at an NFL stadium, a home team each year, you have 8, maybe 9 games. SoFi Stadium here, we've got 2 home teams, the Rams and the Chargers. So let's say there's 20 NFL games, sort of regular season per year. I looked up recently that SoFi Stadium also hosts about 20 to 30 concerts in an average year. So we're talking about 50 days or nights out of 365 days in the year. So the jobs that align with that in terms of the full capacity operations and hospitality team, that's really part-time work. That is not a full-time job for most people working in that space. So I think, yes, the number of jobs on paper, it kind of fluctuates up and down with these big events, but it's not necessarily sort of family sustaining full-time work that we really want to have for people in our communities. And then there's the taxes question. So absolutely, it's true. A new stadium can bring new revenues for taxes, both property tax, also, consumer spending at the stadium itself or at hotels. The problem is a new stadium also brings a bunch of extra costs. So whether or not that stadium is something that is publicly funded or privately funded, a city will have to pay things like extra for policing or managing traffic around these events. Maybe you need larger sanitation crews to pick up all the trash that ends up on the ground after, especially after tailgating. Your roads, your power grids, your sort of basic infrastructure all have this extra toll because of this really massive thing you've just built. So yes, the tax revenue goes up, but also your costs do too, which is why economists have found this is not necessarily a net positive in the long run. And so, yeah, we're in this really interesting moment where it seems, and also, economists have been saying this for decades. This is not even that new at this point. It seems finally we have some city leaders recognizing this and saying, yes, we don't want to spend public money on this. LA is an example of that, to their credit. But yet there's, at the same time, there continue to be others who are like, absolutely, let's throw millions of dollars at these teams to lure them to our city or to keep them in our city, right? So the Buffalo Bills Stadium I mentioned is one example of that. I think Indiana, in trying to lure the Chicago Bears, just has made a pretty big, lucrative offer for funding subsidies. KC Chiefs Stadium is also another example. So, one of the questions I think that I have is sort of, we have decades of research at this point. Why are we still making this mistake in some cities and some states offering this public funding?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I want to switch gears, and I want to talk about the cost to athletes, and I'll direct this question to you, Jules, because you just wrote a book about being a professional footballer, and I was wondering if you could talk about what it took to get to that level of competition. I mean, obviously, you trained really hard. You're a hard worker. I know that. So you trained really hard, and so there's some personal sacrifice going on there. But there must have been also a lot of cost to your whole family. I mean, yeah, your mom got some daycare while you were off training when you were young, and you burned energy. But as the competition goes up, there's a lot of cost in terms of the family's money, the family's time. And then as you reach those higher levels, there is so much cost that athletes have to take on in order to be able to compete at that level. And many of those costs are just hidden to fans. Can you sort of like talk us through that, using your own personal experience and what you've observed with other elite athletes?
Sure. Well, I would say first and foremost, to reach really high levels of sporting success, almost across the board, that means you have to be an absolute maniac. Like you have to make that the focus of your life. Most of your brain power is going into that endeavor. That was certainly my experience. And I'm not bragging. Actually, I'm a little embarrassed to say that because there's a lot of good things you could be thinking about and focusing on in this world. And I wasn't doing any of that. I was maniacally focused on becoming a better soccer player by either training, by watching video, by studying the game, by talking to people, by watching matches live whenever I could. I was an absolute maniac. And there was some real prices to pay for that. I think you're raising something that not enough people think about, and that is your family. If you're lucky enough to have a family that's invested in helping you with your career, they are going to sacrifice their own lives for you, whether it's money, whether it's time, whether it's any number of resources that they might have at their disposal. And so I was fortunate. I mean, I had a family that was willing to do that. We had the option there, two parents working and enough money to make it happen, but that does not fit every single person out there. So I think another thing to think about is I was a non-unionized athlete. So when I was playing professional soccer, I did not have a union. That's changed quite a lot with the highest levels of sport in the United States. At least all of them are unionized. And I think if you look at a recent study that I find really interesting from a global advocacy group called Global Athlete, they did a study that compared the amount of revenues, the percentage of the revenues from various sports like the NBA, the English Premier League of football, soccer, the NHL, the NFL, and they compared those leagues to the amount of revenue that Olympians were getting. And it dropped my face just like dropped in shock when I saw it, because in those other leagues, the NBA, Premier League, NFL, NHL, the athletes, because they have unions, were making 45 to 60% of the revenues, 45 to 60. Folks, think about what it was just in your head. Think about, what do you think the percentage of revenue Olympic athletes get? They got 4.1%. And the authors of the study would definitely want me to say that direct revenues, those Olympic athletes that we watch on our TV screens every 2 years now, they only got 0.5% directly. So somebody's covering those costs if it's not the people in the Olympics that are doing so. That's the families, that's the communities that support these various Olympic athletes. Now, there's been a lot of pushback from Olympians and aspiring Olympians, and there's been some really good organizing from groups like Global Athlete, but also from groups that are trying to unionize specific sports like swimming. And it's starting to bear fruit. So at the last Olympics, Summer Olympics in Paris, World Athletics, which oversees track and field events, they started giving out $50,000 to the gold medal winners. That caused a lot of stir from these other international federations overseeing these other sports. Oh my gosh, if they're going to start paying, that means we might have to someday. And it turns out World Athletics is now talking about paying bronze and silver medalists as well at the LA Olympics. Because of all the pressure and because of the fact that it's just kind of jaw-dropping these unfairnesses, that now the International Olympic Committee has said just in the last few weeks that they're going to start giving athletes $10,000 scholarships. They're calling them scholarships, okay? So every Olympian is eligible for $10,000 scholarship, which sounds a lot like some of the language that we used to hear, especially around college athletes. Like, they don't need to get paid because they're getting a scholarship. And second, $10,000, hey, it sounds like a lot of money. I'd take it. Don't get me wrong. It's a lot of money to me. But for 4 years for an Olympian, that means like $2,500 a year pre-taxes. Like, it's actually not that much. It's not going to take you that far. So you're raising a really important question here. And that's why a lot of times, sports are essentially an exercise in class bias. A lot of the people that can ultimately succeed in sports come from particular social classes. And those that don't make it often are because they're from a different social class, a poorer economic social class. I mean, we hear the opposite, how this can be this trampoline for folks from the working classes and the working poor. And that's true, but we shouldn't forget the other side of this equation as well.
No, that is such an important point. Yeah, one of the things that we highlighted, we cite in the book, the textbook, is for a triathlete to train for the 2024 Olympics, on average, it costs them $100,000, and they're not getting paid right. As you were saying, right now, in tennis, right, Wimbledon is going on, and there's been discussion about boycotting some of the majors because the athletes, they get such a small percent compared to in the unionized sports. And so these costs are enormous. I just recently peer-reviewed a book manuscript. I don't know if I can talk about it because it isn't under contract yet that I know of, but it's specifically on, we have this idea of sport as an avenue of social mobility for poor kids that are willing to work hard, be disciplined, and sacrifice. But overwhelmingly, athletic success is tied to family wealth of individual athletes. Just like why does the United States dominate, or do so well, I should say, in so many different categories of international sports? Because we have so much wealth here that we can spend, and that's just true across the board. So these are like fantastic points. I want to switch because we're going to run long on time if we're not careful, which is oftentimes the case. Because we've talked about sports as the cost of sports, of these mega sporting events to communities. We've talked about it now in terms of the cost to athletes, but what about the cost of fans? Can we talk a little bit about that? I'm trying to find I had some notes on here I wanted to share. Oh, here it is. So we talk about this in the textbook. Over the last 30 years, the cost of attending an NHL game, has seen a 209% increase. The cost of attending an NBA game has increased by 213% over the last 30 years. MLB games have gone up by 224%, and and a similar number for the NFL. So the cost of attending these has certainly outpaced the rate of inflation. But then I was like, well, what about this World Cup? Because I've been hearing about the cost of World Cup tickets. So in 1994, World Cup tickets ranged from $60 to $475. But 30 years later, in 2026, they range from $2,030 to $32,970. And so I wanted to see what is the percent increase there, and I couldn't believe it. I had to triple check this and used an online calculator because I didn't trust my math. That is a 3,283% to 6,841% increase. How do we explain? Two questions here. First, how do we explain this incredible astronomical increase in the cost of World Cup tickets? And two, where is all that money going if it's not going back to the communities that are taking the brunt of these events?
Well, I love that math work that you just did there, Jeff, and I think it's really important. And it also shows why the subtitle of one of the books you mentioned in my biography is The FIFA Greed Machine. I think that explains a lot of what we're seeing with the 2026 World Cup. To break it down a little further, there are two main markets that FIFA, the world's governing body for soccer, oversees with tickets for the World Cup in 2026. First is the one on their own platform. And like you said, there's been an enormous raise in price of tickets over time. The World Cup final, to buy a ticket to the World Cup final can be like almost $11,000 on the FIFA platform. Only 4 years ago in Qatar, it was $1,600 for the biggest, highest priced tickets. So there's a huge leap going on there. Then you look at the secondary market, which is when you buy a ticket and you try to resell it. That's when prices really go wild. But FIFA loves that. And here's why. Because when somebody resells a ticket, FIFA takes 15% of the resale value from the seller and 15% from the buyer. You heard that right. They take 30% of the ticket price on the secondary market. So I saw a ticket going online for $11 million to the final. Now, I'm not saying they're going to sell that puppy online, but if they did for $11 million, FIFA would be taking well over $3.5 million from a single ticket. So these are political questions because in the United States, they're using what they call dynamic pricing. And you hear the word dynamic, you're like, awesome, I like dynamic stuff. Not awesome if you're trying to buy a ticket to this World Cup. Not awesome at all. But it's a political question because, for example, in Mexico, if you were to try to resell one of your tickets in Mexico, they've made it so you can't sell it for more than the face value of the ticket. So you don't see those huge jumps in prices on the secondary market. Same thing in Ontario, the state in Canada that encompasses Toronto. They also did something similar. So these are political questions. In the hyper-capitalist United States, they did not take on that political question and really look it in the eye. Instead, they allowed the market, if you will, to decide. And FIFA loves it when we let the market decide. Now, they might have gone too far in this case in the sense that there are a lot of disgruntlement with fans who are basically getting priced out. I mean, the tickets are just so high priced now that everyday people can't possibly afford them. And maybe we're hitting a pivot in the road in terms of how fans will react to this.
And just over the same time period, thinking beyond FIFA and thinking back to sort of our regular, whether it's NHL, NFL, NBA, WNBA, so forth, the regular game tickets have gone up too, right? As you were saying, Jeff. And I think there's been an important shift at the same time as we see stadiums designed in a different way physically, right? So 30, 40, 50 years ago, our stadiums had a lot more just general seating. And the trend in stadium design since then has been to knock some of that general seating down and put in these VIP boxes or corporate boxes where the stadium owners, whether that's public or private, have this kind of guaranteed revenue from corporate sponsors who are sort of regularly buying out these boxes. And that's a kind of safer economic bet for them. So unfortunately, it seems we're in a situation, and, like Jules was saying, it's sort of the market, quote unquote, but it's a sort of it's designed in a very deliberate way to extract as much profit. And I think the stadium owners are realizing there's a base of very wealthy people and corporations that can meet the price that they're setting. And that is going to continue for the foreseeable future. And yes, okay, we can say that's just the market, but what is the cost of that, right? That means that regular people are excluded from attending games, and that that's a huge threat to just regular fandom and being able to enjoy a sport and to see your heroes play if you don't have a ton of money to spend.
Yeah, I love the way that you're talking about this with the market, because we hear that term, the market, and it sounds impersonal and objective, just a set of relationships that are operating, and there's no one really like behind that, no specific person behind it. But as you were saying, these are all political decisions that people have made, and that language of objectivity obscures the fact that there are people that are making tremendous amounts of money off of the stadiums, the events. As citizens, we pay for these stadiums through our taxes and other ways, and then get priced out of it. And we love the sports and we want to be there. I remember reading an article that talked about the old Three River Stadium in Pittsburgh. To your point, Carrie Ann, that yeah, a lot of the seating was uncomfortable and it wasn't like the best place to watch a game, but it was almost all general admission, and it was a working family could afford to go and watch their team. But now we have these, and I looked into taking my son one time to a Steelers game when we lived in Pennsylvania, and we couldn't afford it. I'm a college professor, and I couldn't afford to take my family to an NFL game in their new, Heinz Stadium, because it was so expensive. So this all, of course, raises the next question. So in a democracy, what can we do about these things? They're extremely expensive to communities. They're really undemocratic. What can people do? What can we tell students that are listening to this podcast? How can they make a difference?
I think for me, part of it starts with information, right? And so as for students, as they're learning this stuff, be the next teacher of this topic, right? Tell people about the costs and impacts of mega events, the costs and impacts of stadiums, because we do need to build a sort of broader set of residents in every host city or potential host city that have this understanding. Because what happens so often is, a proposal for a stadium is put out there, someone is bidding for a mega event, and these things just roll quickly through the approval processes or selection processes before most sort of like regular people in the city have even had a chance to hear about it or to read about it, to really get to understand what this is about. So I do think part of it is increasing our public awareness and understanding. And we're starting to see that, right? So when it comes to the Olympics, it turns out when a city actually offers its citizens a chance to vote in a referendum, time and time again, people say, yeah, no thanks. And I think that referendum aspect is really important, because when you have a chance to vote on something, ideally, right, you're going to figure out, okay, what is this issue? How do I feel about this? And even just requiring a process like that would be a huge deal in terms of inviting public debate, inviting public learning together. We don't see that, unfortunately, a lot in U.S. cities or in the U.S. more broadly for our big mega events. So I think advocating for more opportunities for us to have input is really important. We're also just seeing on a more grassroots level, local organizing. So here in LA, I'm part of the No Olympics LA Coalition. And, it formed initially while the city was still bidding to host for the Olympics. That's back in 2017. And, our coalition was ultimately unsuccessful in that moment at stopping the bid, right? But we've done a lot of work since to attempt to inform our neighbors, to kind of build these networks and a coalition, right, of people who have these concerns about the impacts, and that will be ready in the future if there's a new stadium proposed, a new mega event proposed, to say, actually, this is not what we want. And we're going to put a big grassroots effort into informing our neighbors and building public opposition to these things.
Yeah, and maybe Jules can talk about this issue from the perspective of the IOC and FIFA, because they now, as they realize this, are going to go to countries that are controlled by dictators and autocrats, where voting on accepting these events doesn't occur. And so are we going to see mega events actually moving increasingly to countries that are not democratic?
Well, don't take it from me, take it from FIFA directly. Their Secretary General, a guy named Jerome Valk, said very directly that FIFA likes working with dictators because you don't get all these pesky questions, these pesky democratic questions that Carrie Ann is talking about. It's just a lot easier to get stuff done. And we've certainly seen a shift over time where a lot of these sports mega events already are moving to more authoritarian countries. China hosting the Olympics twice, Russia with its decade of sport hosting the Sochi Olympics in 2014 and then the Men's World Cup in 2018. And now with Saudi Arabia in 2034 hosting the World Cup. I think I should point out that also, the United States has become quite a bit more authoritarian as well. And if you don't want to take it from this political scientist, take it from a lot of other ones. There's a VDEM Institute in Stockholm in Sweden that has pointed out that the United States has made a sharper backslide in its democratic practice than any country in recent history. And there's just a lot of evidence for that. And sports mega events are not helping because they create this state of exception that we were talking about that allow FIFA, the International Olympic Committee, political leaders in the host country to suspend the normal rules, to avoid democratic practice in the way that Carrie Ann was describing. And, I love the question about like what students can do about this, because it can kind of feel overwhelming sometimes when you're hearing all these facts and figures about these sports mega events that maybe you've been watching your whole life and really enjoying, and all of a sudden you're having like a cognitive dissonance moment. I would say, to add to what Carrie Ann was saying, in addition to building up your knowledge and sharing it with other people, thinking about not falling into a couple traps that I think are kind of common. One of them is thinking about the millionaires versus billionaires debate. The athletes are the millionaires and the owners are the billionaires, but they're all not us. I don't encourage you to think about it that way. I encourage you to maybe think about it more. Yes, a lot of these athletes are millionaires, but they're also worker athletes. And the amount of wealth that the owners of these teams have accumulated is so far off the charts that it's not even really fair to say millionaires and billionaires in the same sentence. The other trap is when you're seeing groups like No Olympics LA in Los Angeles, or you're seeing groups in Hamburg in Germany creating all these referenda for people to vote on whether the German cities should host the Olympics, don't view them as spoil sports, because that's another trap that can sometimes happen. Oh, they're just trying to ruin our time. No, actually, a lot of the people involved in these struggles care deeply about sports and they want them to be for everybody. And so you probably have more in common with those activists that some people insist on calling spoil sports than you do with the billionaires who are spoiling the sport for real.
I'm still laughing about that, Jules. Okay, that is a great way to wrap up this episode. We've, as is usually the case, we've gone over our hour already, so we got to bring it to a close. Jules, Carrie Ann, thank you so much for coming on. This is a fantastic episode, sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. And for folks listening, keep an eye out for our next exciting topical episode of the Sports and Society podcast. And you can always join the conversation on our Sports and Society Discord server. An invite link is available in the episode description. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.